Dennis Condrey passed away over the weekend, and I am in the midst of writing something very, very extensive on Dennis Condrey. I'm going to hope to have this out in the next day or so, but not going to do the entire breakdown here because I've been writing about him quite a bit today. But Dennis Condrey is quite literally one of the greatest tag wrestlers of all time, and it's not just with the with the team with Bobby Eaton. I mean, that was one version of the Midnight Express, but he preceded that with the prior incarnation of the Midnight Express with Randy Rose, and then even as like a trio with Norvell Austin. But Dennis Condrey was 76 years old and did not, unlike Bobby Eaton, who he's so closely linked to, like Bobby Eaton was like just born to become a professional wrestler and was like volunteering at the age of 12. And with Dennis Condrey, he didn't follow wrestling at all as a kid growing up. He played football and he wrestled in high school. And it turned out his sister married a pro wrestler named Joe Turner. And this guy, Joe Turner, who wrestled for Jim Crockett Sr., saw that Condrey, he was an athlete, and they were doing the deal on television where Bob Roop, who was an Olympic-level wrestler, would challenge fans out of the stands. And so they set Condrey up to be one of the guys that would come in, and had no idea that this was a work or anything. He was just sent in there, and he lasted until the end with Bob Roop, and then Roop finally caught him and pinned him. But it was kind of a mark of distinction that he did not get submitted. And Jim Crockett Sr. gave him a role as a referee, and from there became a wrestler. And he started off his career, like his main booking offices were in Memphis, first with Nick Goulas, and then when Goulas and Jerry Jarrett had their split in 1977, he went with Jarrett's side. And then he was also like pretty prominent in Southeastern Championship Wrestling, which was based out of Knoxville, Tennessee, for Ron Fuller. And those were the two major places that he was working as. And he had a series of really influential tag teams. There was his team with Phil Hickerson, which began around 1975. They were known as the Bicentennial Kings, and they worked throughout Tennessee. They had big programs with Robert Gibson, who of course would later be part of the Rock and Roll Express, and Robert Gibson's brother, Ricky Gibson. They had a lot of really big matches, especially throughout Tennessee. And after Phil Hickerson underwent knee surgery, well, then Dennis bounced around partners, and he ended up teaming with Dr. D, David Schultz. They had quite a run together. It wasn't a very long run in Memphis, but it was one that they complemented each other very well. As I was speaking with somebody in the industry today, we were both remarking that Dennis Condrey, he would never be described as never blessed with youthful looks. I made the remark he definitely had the Sir Oliver Humperdinck aging gene, where this photo of Dennis Condrey he was probably 30 years or under in this photo. That was Dennis Condrey, not exactly your matinee idol look, but it was not the aesthetic he was going for either. But it was funny because in Memphis, he actually feuded a bit with Bobby Eaton, and this was years before they would come together and of course have their very famous team together. He would expand wrestling for Georgia Championship Wrestling, broke out as a singles star in Georgia for a time, but his bread and butter was as a tag wrestler. I think that was where he had just his greatest influence. And again, it was with a number of different partners. And the Midnight Express concept, of course, it was influenced by the 1978 movie, and of course the famous chase theme that they would come to the ring with several years later. But it began with Condrey with Randy Rose, and then they brought on Norvell Austin together in Tennessee. And then it was in 1983 that they're working in Memphis, and Bill Watts' territory was going through a period where some of their gates were down. And so Bill Watts leaned on Jerry Jarrett and said, what do we need in our territory? And Jerry Jarrett thought that it was all these big athletes and you're not appealing to women. And Jerry Jarrett said it in a a much more X-rated term than that, but basically described that you need to be attracting, you need performers that are going to attract women, and that answer was Dennis Condrey, clearly. But no, this led to Memphis. They created this trade, and Watts selected both Condrey and Eaton, who were not teaming together at this point, but he was the one that got these two and decided to put them together, along with Jim Cornette, who had been a photographer in Memphis and now was starting as a manager, but was kind of down the pecking order behind Jimmy Hart. So this was a big breakthrough for Cornette. But they also got the Rock and Roll Express. They got Terry Taylor, Bill Dundee. Like, Mid-South kind of made out like bandits in this talent exchange for that time. And this version of the Midnight Express, like, they had a huge run in Mid-South, primarily feuding with Bill Watts and with Junkyard Dog when they went through a series of matches in the spring of '84. They went to the Louisiana Superdome. I mean, it was like the most lucrative, like, 5-week period in Mid-South's history, and it kind of cemented these guys as draws, and Jim Cornette as a huge part of the act of being able to cut the promos for them. You had this state-of-the-art tag team, and that kind of really set them off to the races. They went to World Class for about 6 months, and then they land in Jim Crockett Promotions, which was their most famous run that they had from 85 to 87, where they feuded with the Rock and Roll Express, who came in shortly thereafter, the Fantastics, the Road Warriors. They had the big scaffold match with the Road Warriors at Starrcade 86. And like, the team was on fire. They were doing well. Business was very good in 85 and 86. And in 87, like, it's getting, you're seeing some of the cracks there. And it was this bizarre story where they worked the show, and they were going to meet up the next day because they had a day off and they were heading to San Francisco. And Condrey ended it by, "I'll see you guys tomorrow." And he just never showed up, and he disappeared, and they didn't know what the deal was. And Condrey just left. And there were all these stories at the time, one being that they had this meeting with the WWF in 86, and that Eaton and Cornette were on the side of, like, they've got a great gig going in Jim Crockett Promotions, and that's where they're best suited. And Condrey feeling like this was the time to go to WWF. Like, there was a lot of money to be made. Now, in later years, he would not lean on that story, but contemporaneously at the time, that had been one of the stories, and the other being like burnout that he had gone through. And so his career kind of goes on a divergent path. He goes to the AWA and reforms his team with Randy Rose as the original Midnight Express, which did lead to a feud in 1988 in Jim Crockett Promotions. And that was kind of his swan song. Like, he continued wrestling until around late 89, early 90. And then that was pretty much it for his, like, full-time run as a professional wrestler. And he was relatively young. Like, when he leaves Jim Crockett Promotions, he's only about 35 years old. So it's not like he was that old at that particular time. But in the 2000s, he did a bunch of the Midnight Express reunions, did come out of retirement for some shows. He was briefly a trainer in Florida Championship Wrestling for WWE. And this image that Way pulled up, this was, I guess, the last time he was featured. This was not on television, I believe. I think it was like a dark segment where CM Punk and FTR, they were in Greenville, South Carolina, and brought Condrey into the ring. And this is after he had quietly gone through cancer, and it had affected his voice box, where so his voice had been radically altered because of the cancer. But yes, passed away this past weekend at the age of 76. So, a very, very influential tag wrestler who, because of obviously the Cornette connection, you had so many guys in OVW that studied these tapes. I think John Cena even recently referenced, like, these tapes that Cornette would have them study. And you have to imagine the Midnight Express were a frequent tag team that so many of these, obviously FTR, but many other teams drew so much from. And there was one year that we were at the Hall of Fame when the Rock and Roll Express were inducted by Jim Cornette. And there was this big clamoring that's like the Midnights should open the door for the Midnights to go in. And they never did put them into the WWE Hall of Fame, which is unfortunate because now both Eaton and Condrey have passed away. Stan Lane is still alive. But anyway, they did get a mention. It was a brief mention during Tonight by Michael Cole, and I thought it was interesting. It was a cool deal that they had taped Collision last Wednesday, and they had Tony Schiavone do an audio insert into one of the matches on, I believe it was Saturday's broadcast, just to get the mention in there about Dennis Condrey, which I would imagine like you will have, at least FTR with like their Midnight Express themed gear for probably Dynasty or whatever's coming up in the near future.
Yeah, for me, I mean, that whole era represents a real blind spot in my viewing and consumption, certainly before my time. And it's unfortunate that, it's one of those things where if you're not necessarily a part of like the WWE's history, you're not really brought up so much, at least, in terms of footage, being shown. Like your stuff is not really as referred back to as often, at least through modern sources. So you kind of have to do a little bit of work in order to seek it. But I do believe a lot of it's still out there on YouTube, even though the network obviously is no longer around.
Yeah, I mean, it helps like they own the footage, so it at least existed there on the network. But now, yeah, you do have to do a bit more searching. But because of like them being on television, like you can get like quite a bit of Midnight Express stuff. And it's like, even if you just want to go down the rabbit hole of the promos, like that to me really stands out of like just how important Jim Cornette was to that whole Midnight Express act, which was very, very significant. It's an interesting question as well about the like 1986. If they had gone to WWF, like the knee jerk reaction is that would have been a tough fit. Imagining the Midnight Express in the WWF, you would have had Cornette as a talker. I think that would help. But you imagine a tag division where you've got like the Hearts in there, the Bulldogs, the Killer Bees, the Rougeaus, later like Tully and Arn. I think it would have been a tough go for them in the WWF. And if Cornette would have been the biggest asset to them as a talker, I almost wonder if they would have seen Cornette as more valuable with somebody else. Because I think he would have shined in WWF in the mid 80s, like with his mouth. Condrey and Eaton, like not that the Hart Foundation or some of these other teams were like the biggest guys, but they were significantly bigger than these two, and they wouldn't be wrestling the same type of Midnight Express matches that they could have in Jim Crockett Promotions. And it was also a promotion that was much more, they valued their tag scene like significantly more. So I do think it was the right choice that they stayed there, but it was obviously an attempt by Vince McMahon, whether it was to just harm Jim Crockett Promotions or if he saw something in the Midnight Express. The Post Wrestling Cafe is your one-stop shop for all of the coverage that Post Wrestling has to offer. 2 big rewind-aways this month with WWF Insurrection from May of 2002. This UK-only pay-per-view featured the Raw brand going overseas and ending with the infamous plane ride from hell. Then we're going to take a look at AWA's Super Sunday from April of 1983. A new edition of Talk Can Be Yours, plus MCU Later, Book Club, and coverage of UFC 326, TNA Sacrifice, and of course, XL editions of Rewind to Raw, Dynamite, and SmackDown with all the news of the day. Join now at postwrestlingcafe.com.